Good evening, and welcome back. I hope the fire finds you well tonight. Come curl up near the warmth, and let's toss another log on the fire, because where we're going tonight, well, you'll find very little there to warm you up. Tonight's story is not one of hurried bloodshed, nor the rage of a spree killer. No. This tale is the slow, meticulous horror of a man who waited for the grave to grow cold before making his claim. So come with me to the frozen farmlands of Wisconsin in the year 1957, under skies that hung low and heavy with winter, and meet a man who lived and died beneath his mother's shadow. A man who feared women, but feared being without them even more. So, if you think the monsters of fiction are the worst this world can conjure, then you have not yet met the Plainfield Ghoul. Edward Theodore Gein came into this world on August 27th, 1906, a second son born into a house where love was rationed and faith was weaponized. Augusta Gein ruled the family with a preacher's fury, preaching that the world was steeped in sin and that women, save but herself of course, were little more than temptresses in league with the devil. His father, George, was a weak man, beaten down by drink and by life, offering no shelter from Augusta's fire. The marriage endured not for love, but because their faith forbade its undoing. When Ed was still a boy, Augusta moved them to a desolate farm outside the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, a place far from temptation, where her sons could grow under her unblinking eye. Ed's days were measured out in chores and scripture. He rarely left the farm, except for the walk to and from school. And even there, his awkward smile, sudden fits of laughter, and timid voice made him the target of cruel jokes. Still, he did well in his lessons, especially in reading, and tried in every way to please the only woman whose approval he craved. But Augusta's praise was a currency rarely spent. She told her boys they would never be more than failures like their father, and in time, Ed began to believe her. Eddie looked up to Henry. To him, his older brother was everything a man ought to be. Strong in character, steady in work, a man who could be trusted to see things done right. After their father's death in 1940, the brothers took on odd jobs to keep the farm afloat. They fixed roofs, mended fences, hauled lumber. But while Henry labored for the farm, Eddie often found himself in the homes of neighbors, watching over their children. He liked babysitting, liked the way children saw the world, uncomplicated, trusting. In truth, Eddie never outgrew that same simplicity himself. But Henry had begun to see the cracks in their life, and the source of them. He worried about Eddie's unhealthy devotion to Augusta, and said so more than once. To Eddie, these words were like blasphemy. Augusta was pure, Augusta was truth, Augusta was his love. How could Henry not see all of this? Then, on May 16th, 1944, a brush fire crept too close to the farm. The brothers went out to fight it, each moving in opposite directions along the flames. Night fell fast. Eddie said he lost sight of Henry. When the blaze was finally out, he told the police his brother was missing. The search party followed Eddie across the farm, and to their surprise, he led them straight to Henry's body. Henry lay on the ground, untouched by fire, a few dark bruises blooming on his head. Deciding without thought that wee Edward Gein was certainly incapable of crime, the coroner wrote asphyxiation on the report, and the matter was quietly closed. Henry's death left Eddie alone with Augusta, and that suited him just fine. No one to question her, no one to speak against her word. For the next year, his life fell into the rhythm she dictated, the Bible each afternoon, the sharp lessons about the world's evil, the sermons about women who lured men to their ruin. It was a suffocating devotion, but Eddie didn't fight it. In fact, he clung to it like a rag doll. In Augusta's eyes, he still had worth. Then, in December of 1945, a series of strokes left Augusta weak and finally gone. Eddie's foundations crumbled. Harold Schechter would later write that Eddie had lost his only friend and one true love, and now he truly was alone in the world. After Augusta's death, Eddie preserved her presence as best he could. He boarded up the rooms she had lived in, the upstairs, the parlor, the living room, leaving them frozen in time. He lived in a small room off the kitchen, a narrow, airless space where dust and quiet settled thick. The farm no longer rang with a mother's voice. Now, the only voices came from the pages of pulp magazines, grim tales of grave robbers, death cults, and strangers who dared to make the dead live again. The winter of 1945 settled hard over Plainfield. By December, the farmhouse on the edge of town had gone silent. Silent maybe, but not still. It was here, in the hollow shell of his mother's house, that Ed's thoughts began to twist into something unrecognizable. Shortly after her death, he decided he wanted to change himself, to shed the man he was. He began fashioning what he called a woman's suit from the tanned skins of the dead, so he could step inside their flesh and pretend to be a woman. An insane transvestite ritual, the papers would call it later. By night, Eddie began his own projects. The graveyards just beyond town became a place he knew well, the stones and shadows keeping his secrets. And in the darkness, the seeds of the Plainfield Ghoul took root. Plainfield, Wisconsin, November 16th, 1957. The air was ablaze, the kind of cold that bites the lungs and keeps the roads empty. Bernice Worden's hardware store should have been bustling that Saturday morning. But when her son Frank stopped by, the silence was strange. No ringing bell over the door, no voice calling out from behind the counter. Instead, there was the faint smell of blood and a single sale slip lying on the counter, the last transaction she'd made that day. A gallon of antifreeze sold to Ed Gein. Frank remembered seeing Eddie in the shop the night before. He'd said he'd be back in the morning for it. And now, Bernice was gone. The sheriff's men drove straight to the Gein farm, a place locals already whispered about. A sagging ruin of a house on a cold stretch of dirt road, where the curtains stayed drawn and no one was welcome inside. What they found in the shed froze even the most hardened among them. Bernice hung upside down from the rafters, ropes at her wrists, a crossbar between her ankles. The body had been dressed out like a deer, shot once with a .22 rifle, then mutilated after death. Inside the house, the horror deepened. 4 noses, 9 masks of human skin, bowls made from skulls, 10 heads with the top sawed off, chairs upholstered with human hide, Mary Hogan's head in a paper bag, Bernice's in a burlap sack, 9 vulvas in a shoebox, a belt stitched from women's nipples, a lampshade pulled tight over the curve of a human face, and the smell. Oh my. Thick, clinging, a blend of rot and burnt. When the questions came, Eddie spoke without hurry. Between 1947 and 1952, he said, he made as many as 40 nocturnal visits to 3 local graveyards to exhume recently buried bodies. He had gone to the cemeteries in a daze. Most nights, he would come to his senses before digging. But sometimes he would bring someone home. Middle-aged women who reminded him of Augusta. Their skin tanned and stitched into the woman's suit he had been making, so he could become her. Sex with the dead, he insisted, was never the point. He said the smell was too bad. But the truth was darker still, because long before the suit was finished, there had already been blood. In the warmth of the tavern on a cold December night in 1954, Mary Hogan, loud, brash, and nothing like Augusta, vanished. And now, years later, Ed Gein quietly admitted to shooting her dead too. By the time the cuffs clicked shut around Ed Gein's wrists, Plainfield had already begun to shrink from him, as if the whole town hoped that by keeping its distance, it might forget what had been pulled from the shadows. But forgetting wasn't possible. Not when the sheriff's men had seen what they'd seen. Not when the photographs whispered hauntingly from locked evidence drawers. On November 21, 1957, Ed was arraigned for the murder of Bernice Worden. He ended a plea that would set the tone for everything to follow. Not guilty by reason of insanity. The doctors agreed. He was unfit to stand trial. His mind a patchwork of grief, obsession, and delusion, stitched tight around the image of his mother. They sent him to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane, a fortress of locked doors and barred windows. And for more than a decade, he disappeared behind them, while the world outside moved on. It wasn't until November the 14th, 1968, that the courts finally deemed him competent enough to face judgment. The trial lasted just a week. Judge Robert H. Gulmar presided, listening to testimony that sounded less like a legal case and more like a horror story told by men who still saw it in their dreams. Guilty, they ruled, but legally insane. He would never see a prison cell. Instead, Ed returned to the hospital, where the walls didn't just keep him in, they kept the rest of the world safe from what was inside him. He lived there quietly for the rest of his life, painting, doing odd jobs for staff, even laughing at jokes the nurses couldn't quite find funny. On July 26, 1984, Ed Gein died of respiratory failure. No family stood by his bedside, no friends to mourn him. Only the faint hum of hospital machines and the knowledge that a chapter in Wisconsin's darkest history had finally closed. Yet, even in death, his shadow stayed stitched into the fabric of American horror. In the masks of Leatherface, the quiet menace of Norman Bates, and the twisted hunger of Buffalo Bill. Because we learned, sometimes, the monsters born of our nightmares have a face that once smiled politely from across the street. Thanks for listening. This has been Fireside Crime Stories, where the darkest tales are always read by Firelight. If you haven't already, subscribe, and before you drift off, toss a little fuel on the fire, hit that like button, ring that bell, so when the shadows shift again, you'll be the first to know that another fire's burning and another story's being told. Until next time, rest well. Still with me, I see. Wonderful. Seems another storm is whispering out there in the dark somewhere. That's all right. Gives us just enough time to toss another log on the fire and leave behind the frost-bitten silence of Wisconsin for the glitter and gamble of the Nevada desert. Close your eyes. Allow that cold to fade from your bones. Snuggle up a little closer to the fire and come with me to Mesa, Arizona in the year 2008. Here, the wind doesn't rattle through bare trees. Instead, it hums through air-conditioned lobbies and the clink of poker chips. The moon doesn't glow through icy white clouds. It shimmers in the mirrored glass of hotel towers. You can smell perfume, cologne, money, and, well, something else you can't quite name that mix of risk and promise, of everything that could go right and everything that could go wrong. And be warned, in the desert heat, danger sometimes comes dressed in sequins and smiles, and love can cut deeper than any winter wind we've just left behind. It was June of 2006, and Las Vegas was holding its usual court, a city where strangers brushed shoulders with celebrities and where every handshake had the faint taste of a gamble. In one of those glittering hotel conference halls, two lives were about to cross paths in a way neither could have predicted. Travis Victor Alexander was 30 years old. By the standards of the world he'd come from, he was already a remarkable success story. Raised in a chaotic, often unstable environment, he'd clawed his way up through faith, discipline, and a relentless work ethic. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had given him a framework for his life: structure, morality, and community. His charm and polished speaking skills had given him the rest. Now, as a motivational speaker and a rising figure in a network marketing company, he was the kind of man who could walk into a crowded room and leave everyone feeling like they'd known him for years. He was tall, clean-cut, with that easy grin that hinted at both warmth and confidence. Friends described him as ambitious, but grounded, charismatic, but genuinely kind. He was looking for the right woman, a partner who matched his faith, his goals, his vision of a future filled with family and purpose. And then she walked in. Jodi Arias, 26, striking in a way that made people stop mid-conversation. She had the kind of beauty that seemed both effortless and carefully curated. Long blonde hair at the time, an easy smile, and eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 private thoughts. Jodi's life, until that moment, had been more restless than rooted. She'd grown up in California, moving between jobs and relationships, searching for something, or perhaps someone, to make her feel seen and secure. She was bright, artistic, and could make anyone feel like they were the only person in the room. But beneath that charm, there was a hunger, the kind that sometimes confused love with possession. The conference that brought them together was meant to inspire financial freedom, personal growth, and the promise that anyone with enough work and vision could rewrite their story. For Travis and Jodi, it became the place where their stories intertwined. It wasn't just attraction, though there was plenty of that. It was the intensity. They spoke, and each sentence seemed to land somewhere deeper than polite conversation. Travis was impressed by her interest in self-improvement, her willingness to ask big questions about life and faith. Jodi, for her part, was swept up in the confidence he radiated, the sense that here was a man who knew exactly who he was and where he was going. And if they came to rewrite their stories, well, this would become chapter 1. When the conference ended, they didn't go back to being strangers. Phone calls followed, emails, long late-night conversations that made miles feel irrelevant. But Travis had one condition: if their relationship was to grow, Jodi would need to share his faith. For him, this wasn't a casual detail, and so, just weeks after their first meeting, Jodi was baptized into the LDS church, with Travis himself there to witness it. Friends noted that she seemed eager to mold herself into his vision of the ideal partner. She dove headfirst into Mormon practices and principles, at least on the surface, but her interest in Travis seemed to go deeper than shared beliefs. The connection between them burned bright and fast, a whirlwind romance that skipped over caution and settled quickly into intensity. They took trips together. They took photos that showed them smiling, wrapped around each other in moments that looked carefree, but, in hindsight, were anything but. There's a dangerous kind of love, the kind that doesn't just want to be near you, it wants to be you, to fold itself so tightly around your life that you can't see where one ends and the other begins. Travis, for all his charm and insight, either didn't see it or thought he could handle it. There were already signs. Jodi, friends would later recall, seemed to appear in his life with uncanny timing, sometimes uninvited, sometimes unexpected. She had a way of showing up that made others uneasy, but was brushed off as romantic persistence. For Travis, who wanted to see the good in people, it may have felt flattering. For his friends, it felt like the first crack in something beautiful. But at this stage, it was still easy to mistake that crack for just another quirk in an intense romance. If you've ever stood at the edge of the desert at night, you know the feeling. The air is warm, almost gentle, but the silence is vast, and somewhere in that silence, there's a weight. You can't name it, but you know it's there. That's how their love was in the summer of 2006. On the surface, it was all late-night laughter and new adventures. Underneath, there was a silence, and in that silence, something was already shifting. Every romance begins with a choice: to let someone in, to hand them the fragile glass of your trust. Travis gave Jodi his, and for a while, it glittered in the desert sun. But glass can cut just as easily as it can shine, and soon the cracks would spread. Because while the story began in a city of bright lights and crowded rooms, it would not stay there. The glitter would fade, the smiles would sharpen, and the heat of that first meeting would turn into something far more chilling. By the autumn of 2006, they were no longer just two people who had met at a conference. They were lovers, though lovers with an unspoken contradiction between them. Travis wanted to live in accordance with his faith, and that meant chastity before marriage. Jodi had no such boundary written into her soul. The truth is, their relationship lived in two worlds. In public, they could play the picture-perfect couple, smiles in photographs, church attendance, shared friends in their network marketing circle. But in private, their connection crossed lines that Travis's faith would later make him feel guilty for. This contradiction, the pull of physical passion against the push of spiritual conscience, became the undercurrent in almost every interaction they had. Jodi was attentive, too attentive. She wanted to know where Travis was, who he was with, when he'd be back. Her texts could be sweet and loving one moment, then demanding the next. Friends began to notice. One recalled that Travis seemed distracted when she was around, as though he was constantly managing her moods. Another remembered that Jodi's presence seemed, well, orchestrated. She'd show up at his house without calling. She'd be in the same places he went, even when he hadn't invited her. If you've ever seen a desert storm form, you'll know it doesn't always come with wind or warning. Sometimes it's just a small change in the air, a heaviness you can't explain. That's what was happening here. By early 2007, the two had officially ended their romantic relationship. Well, at least he had anyway. Travis began seeing other women. Jodi, however, stayed very close. She continued to visit him. She cleaned his house. She cooked for him. She remained part of his life in a way that blurred the line between ex-girlfriend and something much more persistent. And then came the first real fright. Several of Travis' friends would later testify that Jodi was showing signs of obsession. There were stories of her reading through his private messages, of her eavesdropping on conversations, of her becoming visibly upset when he spoke to other women. One friend recalled a conversation in which Travis admitted Jodi sometimes scared him. There was the incident of the slashed tires twice in the same year. Once in late 2007, once again in early 2008. Travis suspected Jodi. He even joked about it to friends, but the humor was nervous. Here's the thing about danger when it's personal. It rarely announces itself like a stranger kicking down the door. More often, it comes as someone you already know. Someone who still smiles at you even as they're holding the match to your world. And Travis was still caught in that push and pull with Jodi. They spoke daily, sometimes intimately. They still saw each other. It was complicated. And it was exactly in that complication that the roots of tragedy began to twist. Jodi was also changing. After the breakup, she moved from California to Mesa, Arizona, just minutes away from Travis, under the pretense of starting fresh. But her fresh start looked remarkably like staying in his orbit. She took up photography professionally, another move that kept her flexible and available to show up in his life. Friends would later remember the look in her eyes when Travis's name came up. One called it calculated adoration. Another called it something else entirely, possession. A heart in love can be a beautiful thing, but a heart in need, that's a place where love can rot. Need will excuse the inexcusable. It will justify control, disguise it as care. And once that kind of need sets in, it's hard to ever make it let go. By early 2008, Travis was preparing for a company trip to Cancun. He wasn't going alone, and Jodi knew it. She didn't like it. In fact, friends recall she seemed more desperate than ever to be back in his bed, back in his life, back in a place where she could say he was hers. The text messages between them in those months, many of which would later become evidence, tell a story in themselves. One day they were filled with flirtation, inside jokes, and the comfortable shorthand of two people who knew each other's minds and bodies well. The next day they were sharp-edged, laced with accusation or disappointment. It was a cycle. Highs that felt intoxicating, lows that left bruises on the soul. And like many caught in that cycle, they both kept stepping back into it, even knowing the damage it was causing. This is where the fire starts to change color, where the warmth becomes heat, and where heat, if you're not careful, starts to burn. Because soon, there would be no more breakups, no more makeups. There would only be one final meeting, and in the days before it, Jodi Arias would set into motion the kind of plan you don't come back from. Some storms roll in with thunder, others you only see in the rear view. By the time you notice, you're already driving through the heart of it. Travis Alexander was in the middle of just such a storm, and the woman at its center, well, she had a thunder all to her own. The door opened, and for a moment, there was nothing but the quiet recognition between them. No shouting, no accusations. Just two people who had once known each other's laughter, now standing in the soft hum of an air-conditioned home in Mesa. Travis's house was still, the warm light spilling through half-drawn blinds. It smelled faintly of cologne and laundry detergent. That lived-in scent of someone who planned to step out into the world the next day, unaware that there would be no next day for him. Jodi smiled. That careful, deliberate smile she'd perfected. She had driven all this way, she said, just to see him, just to spend time together, like old times. And somehow, against the weight of all their jagged history, he let her in. What followed would later be dissected and debated in courtrooms and newsrooms alike. Photographs on a camera, hours of quiet conversation. The kind of closeness that can look like reconciliation to the untrained eye. To anyone else, it might have seemed almost tender, but under the surface, something darker was taking root. They spent the night together. They laughed. They whispered. There was touch, the kind born not of new love, but of something messier. A final intertwining of people who could not quite let go. And as the morning stretched into afternoon, Travis posed for photographs, smiling in some, unaware in others. The digital timestamp sealing each moment in quiet permanence. Somewhere in that sequence of images, somewhere between the easy grin of a man in the shower and the stark stillness that would follow, the line between life and death was crossed. But in these final hours, no one outside those walls could hear the undertow pulling them under. No one could feel the storm tightening its grip. The desert sun burned high above the rooftops. Inside, the air felt heavier, and the clock began ticking in slow motion. It began quietly, like the first flicker of lightning far beyond the horizon, that moment when the air changes, when you can feel the electricity coiling in the silence before the strike. Perhaps it was a word, perhaps a look that lingered too long, perhaps the reminder, unspoken but undeniable, that this was not a reunion, not a fairy tale ending, but the final chapter of something broken beyond repair. Her voice, once sweet, coaxing, turned sharp at the edges. Questions became accusations. Accusations bled into demands. The rhythm of the room shifted. The warmth from the lamplight somehow replaced by a cold, metallic weight in the air. He stepped back, a hand raised, not in violence but in refusal. No more, not again. But that refusal only stoked the embers. What followed was movement, fast, chaotic, and impossible to separate into single moments, splintered into flashes of sight and sound like frames torn from a reel. A gasp, a sudden heartbeat pounding in his own ears so loudly it drowned out the words she hissed through clenched teeth. The hard stamp of feet against tile, a camera tumbling to the floor, its flash firing at random, brief, blinding bursts, catching frozen fragments of the storm. Her face, once a portrait of tenderness, now tight and unyielding, shadows playing across eyes that no longer looked at him, but through him. In her hand, the glint of steel, a shape as cold as the resolve in her grip. Then, into his chest, again and again, the weight of that resolve came down. Furniture scraped sharply against the wall, something toppled, clattering into the unseen. The shower still hissed in the bathroom beyond, a steady rain spilling into porcelain, utterly indifferent to the chaos it was about to frame. They collided. Once, twice, bodies locked in desperate motion, spilling into the narrow hallway. The walls, pale and close, caught the smear of frantic handprints as they stumbled past. And then, the arc, the whisper of the blade through air, followed by the wet, sudden opening of his jugular. The water claimed what poured from him, spiraling crimson into the drain. A silent witness swallowing what it could, while the rest marked the floor in heavy drops. His eyes held what voice could not, a question, a disbelief, a final, desperate plea without sound. He moved, faltered, fell. The storm still hovered above him. And then a single shot cracked through the walls, short and deafening, its echo fading into the hiss of the shower's unbroken rain. When the quiet finally came, it was thick, heavy, the kind that does not invite breath. Nothing in the room was the same, nor would it ever be again, and the air, The air itself seemed to recoil from the ghost of what had just happened. When it was over, the world did not announce it. There was no sudden cry from the heavens, no shattering of glass to mark the end. Only the sound of her breath, ragged at first, then gone entirely, and the steady, indifferent whisper of water still spilling from the shower. She stood there for a moment, as if listening for some confirmation that the storm had truly passed. Her chest rose and fell, eyes fixed not on what was in front of her, but on some distant point far beyond the walls. It was the look of someone stepping back from the edge and deciding not to return. The room was a ruin of motion, objects overturned, trails of where the struggle had carved its path through the space. The air felt thicker now, as if it carried the weight of everything that had just been taken from it. And then, movement. Not frantic this time, but deliberate. The kind of movement that comes when shock has burned itself away and a cold, mechanical part of the mind takes control. Time folded strangely now in this place. Minutes stretched, hours bent and broke, until the dark outside the window looked no different than the dark inside her thoughts. At some point, she looked at him, not as he was in life, but as something unrecognizable now. And in that long, empty gaze, there was no grief, no relief, only calculation. The desert night pressed close to the walls, its stillness mocking the chaos that had come before. And there, in that silence, she began to shape her next steps. Not toward confession, but toward a story she could live with. A story that would change, over and over again, but a truth that would remain as fixed and immovable as the blood drying on the walls. Morning in the desert does not come gently. It rises sharp and unblinking, spilling light over the land like molten glass. Somewhere on a quiet street in Mesa, behind the closed blinds of an ordinary home, the night's violence was already cooling into memory. But she did not linger. She had miles to put between herself and the scene she had left behind. The car was packed with the detritus of a life in motion, clothes that smelled faintly of travel, a stack of CDs for the long drives, an old camera resting on the seat beside her like a silent witness. She slipped behind the wheel, and with the turn of a key, the hum of the engine became the only sound brave enough to fill the space between her and the truth. Highways unspooled beneath her tires, mile after mile of brittle earth and sky, so wide it could swallow her whole. Gas stations came and went, each one a chance to check her reflection, smooth her hair, practice the smile she would use later. It was a strange sort of performance, but she played her role well. To the cashier, she was just another traveler passing through, asking for directions with a polite tilt of the head. To the stranger in the parking lot, she was the friendly woman who offered a warm word about the weather. No one saw the red behind her eyes, or the restless flicker of thought that kept her fingers tightening on the steering wheel. And yet, for all her careful rehearsing, the cracks were there. She spoke too quickly when the questions were small. She lingered too long in restrooms, washing and washing, as if the water could strip away something deeper than dust. Still, the road welcomed her, carried her north toward Utah, Nevada, California. Anywhere but the place where the tiles still bore the memory of her bare feet, and the walls still held the echo of his last breath. The mask held, but only because no one was looking closely enough. She was the star of her own desperate play, and for now, the audience was blind. It is one thing to run. It is another to wander. The runner's pace is frantic, all clipped breath and burning lungs. The wanderer drifts, pausing to smell the coffee, to wave at strangers, to linger in doorways with an easy sort of calm. And Jodi Arias knew that if she was going to slip past suspicion, she would have to master the art of the wanderer. Her first detour came not from necessity, but from strategy. She stopped in small towns with names most people couldn't place on a map, ordering meals she hardly tasted, smiling at waitresses whose kindness cost her nothing. Every receipt became a breadcrumb, a time stamp to stitch into the fabric of her story. In another life, these might have been the meanderings of a free spirit, a woman chasing sunsets and backroads on a whim. But here, each stop was a brushstroke on a false painting, crafted to distract the eye from what lay beneath. There were phone calls too, quick bursts of her voice carried across state lines, reaching friends, family, anyone who could later say she sounded fine to them. Her tone was light, her laugh practiced, the sound of someone whose world was intact. And then there were the photographs. Snapshots taken with casual precision. A gas station sign in the background. A cup of diner coffee steaming in the morning light. Her own face turned toward the camera, eyes bright enough to suggest nothing had been lost. But behind the lens, and behind her eyes, was the constant hum of calculation. Where to go next? What route would seem the most natural? Which lie would taste the sweetest on her tongue when the questions inevitably came? The road through Nevada shimmered with heat, mirages bending the air like molten glass. In another reality, it might have been a beautiful trip, but here, each passing mile marker felt like another line in the story she was scripting for her own survival. By the time she reached California, her path was a strange braid of leisure and escape to anyone watching, and no one was. She was simply a traveler with too much time and too little urgency. To herself, she was the architect of an alibi, building it mile by careful mile, while the truth cooled far behind her. First, it was only a murmur, the kind of news that travels lazily, carried in half-formed sentences and uncertain tones. A man in Mesa. They say it was brutal, no suspect. She heard it before anyone thought to tell her directly, not from a friend, but from the static-laced voice of a radio, as she sipped coffee in a booth by the window. Her hands did not still. They kept stirring cream into the cup, kept the spoon circling in slow, patient loops, but her pulse stuttered in her throat. The announcer's voice was detached, reading the details as though they were simply weather reports. Male victim, age 30, found in his own home, apparent signs of violence, investigation ongoing, no arrests. She let her eyes drift towards the parking lot, pretending to watch the light flare off chrome bumpers and windshields. But inside her, the quiet was already cracking. The road had been hers, wide open, obedient to her plan. But now the road seemed narrower, its edges curling inward. Every town felt smaller, every stranger's gaze a little too curious. At night she lay still under stiff sheets, listening to the thin hum of the air conditioner. The phone on the nightstand, dark and silent, but it seemed heavier than it should have been, as though it already carried the weight of questions. In the days that followed, those whispers thickened into a steady rumor. She caught it in the edges of conversations, in the way people at gas stations glanced at her car plates, in the faint shift of posture when she mentioned where she was from. And then, the call. A voice she knew well, wavering between disbelief and accusation. "You were the last one to see him?" Her answers came smooth, calm as silk drawn over a blade. No, she hadn't been there in weeks. No, she had no idea who could have done such a thing. Her tone was warm enough to comfort, firm enough to close the door on suspicion. But suspicion is a tide. It comes whether you invite it or not. By the time she ended the call, she knew the wanderer's pace could no longer save her. The storm had caught her scent, and its voice was louder now, not a whisper, but a low, unbroken growl rolling in from the horizon. It started with questions, polite, almost conversational. A call from a detective in Mesa, his voice measured and warm, as though they were discussing a simple mix-up in paperwork. But under that velvet tone, she could hear the faint scrape of steel. Just a few things to clear up, he said. Where had she been that week? Had she spoken to him recently? Did she have any reason to visit his home? Her answers spilled out in practiced rhythm, road miles, work obligations, a smile tucked between each sentence. And yet, in the faint pause after each reply, she felt him turning the words over like coins, testing their weight, listening for the hollow ring. In Mesa, they were already walking his rooms, stepping carefully across dark stains that told their own wordless story. They found the camera first, not hidden, but discarded, its lens cracked like a blind eye. Inside it, a sequence of images, time-stamped like a confession. The photographs did not shout, they whispered, her in his home, her with him alive, her in the hours that followed. The pictures were a pulse in the dark, measured and inescapable. She did not know yet that they had them, but something in the detective's questions hinted at knowledge she hadn't given. Her story began to shift, just slightly, like a chair leg rocking on uneven floorboards. She admitted she'd seen him recently. She said she'd dropped by briefly, only to leave again. A tiny crack, nothing more. But cracks, once made, have a way of inviting the water in. From that day forward, the questions multiplied and the spaces between them narrowed. Her phone rang more often. The road that once felt like freedom now seemed to carry her in a slow spiral, always back toward the desert. And in Mesa, the storm was building. Files grew thicker, the photographs sharper, and each step of the investigation drew a darker outline around her name. She was not yet trapped. Not yet. But the air around her was different now. Dense, electric, alive with the sense that time was running out. The invitation came wrapped in courtesy. We'd just like to clear a few things up, they told her. No threats, no accusations, only the steady hum of inevitability beneath their words. She agreed to come. She even smiled when she walked into the Mesa Police Department, a casual grace in her step, as though she was stopping by to help a friend move a couch. But this was no living room. This was the desert's mouth, and, unbeknownst to her, its teeth were patiently waiting. They placed her in a small room, walls the color of dried bone, a table too smooth, chairs that did not invite comfort. Somewhere a vent rattled with cold air that made the space feel smaller still. The detective entered with a file under his arm. Its edges were worn from handling, the spine swollen with photographs, reports, and something else. The weight of certainty. They began softly. Recount your travels, they said. Tell us again about that week. Her voice was steady at first, but every answer circled back to the same jagged place. Her presence in his home. It shifted, reshaped, each telling just slightly different from the one before. And then, they opened the folder. Out came the photographs, not all of them, just enough to make the air in the room change temperature. Images she thought were gone, swallowed by bleach and water and time, now staring back at her from glossy paper. Her smile flickered, like a candle caught in a sudden draft. The detective's tone hardened. Not cruel, never cruel, but sharpened into something that could cut clean through skin. They spoke of timestamps, of DNA that did not care about stories, of neighbors who had seen her car, of the camera they had pieced back together, its wounded lens still remembering everything. And here is where the unraveling began. One story gave way to another. She admitted to being there longer. She admitted to the camera. She admitted to being afraid. But fear in that room no longer belonged to the past. It sat with her now, close enough to taste. By the time the session ended, she was no longer the woman who had walked in smiling. She left with shadows pressed deep into her expression, the kind you cannot wash away with sleep, because she knew the desert had closed its mouth around her, and now the only way out was through. The courthouse in Maricopa County seemed to hum with electricity, not from the lights overhead, but from the hundreds of eyes fixed on a single point, her. Jodi Arias walked in wearing muted tones, hair smooth, glasses perched on her face as though she were preparing for a quiet afternoon in a library. Not the most sensational trial Arizona had seen in years. The image was calculated, crafted with the precision of a painter's brushstroke. She wanted to look small. She wanted to look harmless. But the storm she carried into that room could not be hidden beneath fabric and frames. The prosecution began its work with the discipline of a surgeon. Piece by piece they laid out their instruments, photographs that still breathed heat from the scene, records of phone calls, DNA sealed in sterile bags. Each exhibit was a thread, and with each one they began to weave a tapestry of a night that had been drenched in blood and fury. The defense countered, their voices careful, deliberate, painting her as a woman battered not by fists, but by the erosion of her heart. They spoke of control, of manipulation, of a man who could be both charming and cruel. They urged the jury to see her not as a monster, but as someone cornered in her own fear. And through it all, she sat, her posture poised, her eyes sometimes glistening, sometimes narrowing. Her voice, when she took the stand, a soft and steady instrument she wielded like a blade. For 18 days she told her story. It shifted under questioning, frayed at the edges when pressed too hard, but she wove it with the conviction of someone who had practiced it in the quiet of a cell. She described love. She described betrayal. She described a moment where the world narrowed to survival and then exploded. But the prosecution did not waver. They reminded the jury of wounds too numerous to count, of a sequence of violence that spoke of rage, not fear. They brought them back again and again to the camera, to the final photograph of Travis Alexander alive, and the one taken less than 2 minutes later, when life had already left him. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed, feeding the world a constant stream of headlines, turning the trial into a spectacle that blurred the line between news and entertainment. Inside, the 12 chosen to decide her fate were silent witnesses to a performance that was both legal proceeding and human tragedy. When the gavel fell on the day's testimony, it did not silence the storm. It only paused it, left it coiled and waiting for the next morning's light. The jury filed in slowly, their faces carved from stone. Weeks had passed since they first took their seats, yet the gravity in the room now felt heavier than on any other day. It was the kind of silence that seems to press into your ears, making every creak of a chair, every shuffle of paper, sound far too loud. Jodi sat at the defense table, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her hair fell forward, framing her face like a curtain meant to shield her from the full force of the room's gaze. But nothing could truly shield her now. The clerk rose, holding in their hands the sealed envelope that would decide everything. It was passed to the judge, and the judge's eyes scanned it briefly before handing it back. The words came simply, "We, the jury." Time stretched, the words unspooled like a slow turn of the gallows rope. Find the defendant, Jodi Arias, guilty of murder in the first degree. The air left the room, gasps, muffled cries, the faint rustle of movement, all swallowed by the enormity of that declaration. Jodi did not collapse. She did not cry. She simply nodded slightly, as though she had been expecting the fall of the blade. Outside, the crowd erupted. Some cheered, some protested, some simply stared at the courthouse steps as if the building itself had absorbed something dark and irreversible. But inside, there was no time for spectacle. The sentencing phase loomed ahead, and with it, the possibility of death. The prosecution pressed for it, arguing that the brutality of the crime left no other fitting sentence. They spoke of Travis Alexander's final moments, how he must have felt, the sheer terror and pain that marked his last breaths. The defense fought with equal intensity, pleading for mercy, inviting the jury to see a life that, despite its darkest act, was still worth sparing. Jodi herself addressed the court in this final hour, her voice steady, her words deliberate. She spoke of her own family, of the people who loved her still, and of the way she could contribute from behind prison walls. She even offered to donate her hair to cancer patients, a gesture that some saw as humanizing, and others as manipulative. The jury deliberated, and deliberated, and deliberated still. But in the end, they could not reach a unanimous decision on death. The gavel fell one last time, and Jodi Arias was sentenced to spend the rest of her life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no return to the desert sun, no second act under the wide Arizona sky. Only walls, bars, and the echo of a name that had now been burned into the pages of crime history forever. Thanks for listening. This has been Fireside Crime Stories, where the darkness always lingers and the tales are always true. If you haven't already, subscribe. And before you drift off, toss a little fuel on the fire. Hit that like button, ring that bell, because the next time thunder rolls, you'll want to be here when the fire starts to crackle and another story begs to be told.